So today we're going to talk about 3 things that you need to know with regards to having an estate plan. And today we have our special guest here again, Ryan Knight. Ryan is the owner and estate attorney at Knight Legal. Beacon here works very closely with Ryan, has for many years, and he's been able to provide invaluable advice to our clients and really help set them up to protect what they have. And so I would say that everybody out there watching this video would be able to respond and say, you know, if you've been working and you've acquired anything in your life and everything hasn't been given to you, you're not a trust fund baby. If you're out there today and you worked hard for what you have, then in my opinion, you need to have an estate plan. You need to have one today, and you need to make sure that it's covering all of the different goals and objectives you have. So today we're going to talk about 3 key topics, not the most important necessarily, but just 3 key topics that you need to consider regarding an estate plan. And so, Ryan, what's the first thing that people need to consider when it comes to an estate plan?
I think the very first thing to consider is, one, planning at all. I think statistics have shown about 70% of the population pass away with zero planning done at all. I think that number would be much lower if people realize the consequences of not planning. Now, I do think part of the reason why people don't plan is, one, it's not an easy conversation, but also they just don't know what they need to do. And so that's where, you know, circling around your financial advisor, estate planning attorney, and getting educated on that, attending seminars is super helpful. But planning is important. If you don't plan, some of the consequences of not having something in place means that someone else gets to decide those things for you. I always tell people estate planning is basically you keeping control by giving what you have to who you want to in the most cost-effective and timely manner. And so keeping that control is really important. By not planning, Tennessee and the state and our laws determine who gets what, how they get it, when they get it. And some of those laws, they're called intestacy laws. For example, if you do not have a will and you pass away, a lot of people, they intend everything to go to their spouse when they first pass. That's not going to be the case. If you have children, your spouse will take what's called a child share. So if you had 2 kids, your 2 kids are taking a third each, and then your spouse is taking a third. And again, that's probably not what you want. Most people want everything going to their spouse and then to the kids when the second of you dies. Of course, not planning for incapacities really has a lot of consequences, because then the courts are going to have to step in there. So not planning at all shouldn't be an option. Unfortunately, it's too common.
Yeah, and I would say there's a lot of folks out there that we meet with too that, you know, leaving money behind isn't necessarily the most important item that they're trying to plan for. But to your point, Ryan, planning for a spouse, not having a plan has significant consequences. And so anybody out there who has anything that's valuable to you, you need to have an estate plan. And so what are the planning options? I guess maybe what does it mean to have an estate plan? When people talk about I have an estate plan or I don't have an estate plan, I think there's a lot of people out there that don't know what an estate plan is and really what it's kind of composed of. So just kind of give us a little breakdown as to what is an estate plan and what are the planning options.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, if you have something, you need an estate plan. And there's a common misconception that, oh, well, I have to have a lot to justify planning for my estate. And that's not true at all. If you have something and you want to leave it to someone, that's what estate planning is. Really, estate planning is just another term for taking what you have and giving it to who you want to, but looking at the big picture of that. So not just document preparation, having a will that says, you know, if I have 2 kids, I want everything going 50-50 between them. It's looking at how your beneficiary designations work, how, you know, the terms of your will, making sure your powers of attorney in place. It's looking at it all together and making sure it's accomplishing your goals.
So if you have anything and you die, somebody's going to get that anything. And all we're trying to do is make sure that the individuals that you want to get that, get it in the most efficient manner. And I would even say cost-effective manner, and maybe even like timing, right? Because the timing can be different on different types of estate plans that are out there. Some take longer, some are much shorter. And so, you know, really helping people identify which plan is best for them. There's a lot of people that go, I don't care what happens when I die. I just don't believe that. I believe you've worked way too hard for what you have to not care, right? I mean, I hope there's nobody out there that really, really believes that. Again, we may not be planning specifically to leave lots behind, but if you just happen to leave anything behind, surely there's someone or something you care about more than courts and attorneys. Sorry, Ryan. And,
It's fine.
the IRS. I mean, what we're trying to do is to help minimize the expense by having a plan and make sure that the people that you care about actually get the things that you want. So, number one, have a plan. I mean, probably the most important piece here is to do something. Doing nothing is something. It's a bad something. So how, if somebody does pass away, understanding number two, how property or investments, how those pass along. Give us a little breakdown as to what that structure looks like depending on the different setup.
Yeah, and kind of getting back to what we were talking about earlier, there's different types of assets you own. Some financial accounts you have beneficiaries on. Those pass differently than assets you can't put a beneficiary on, like real estate. And so it's very important to understand the distinction of that. So now, assets that pass through a process called probate are treated different than assets that are what are considered non-probate assets. So first we'll talk about non-probate assets. Those are assets that are kind of like 401ks, IRAs, insurance policies, even your cash accounts. You can put beneficiaries on all those things. Whoever you've named as beneficiary, it will just pay out to them. It is not required to go through a court process called probate. It's not required to be distributed under the terms of your will. It is its own thing, will pass to whoever you've named. It's very important you realize that, because I've had people come in. I'll give you an example. I had an individual come into my office probably about 2 years ago now. His father had passed away. He's a rather wealthy man. He had married later in life. It was a second marriage for him. When he married this lady, went to an attorney to have a will prepared that said, I want everything I own to go 50-50 between my two kids. The attorney didn't ask any other questions. He just prepared a document and said, here you go. Well, at the time of his marriage, he built a house for him and his new wife, as most people do. He put that in her joint name along with his. Financial accounts, his retirement, all that, he put her as the named beneficiary. He ultimately passes away because everything was either jointly owned with his spouse or she was the named beneficiary on it. His kids got nothing. Even though he had a will that said, I want everything I own to go to my two kids 50-50. So he essentially disinherited his spouse for something that he never intended to do. Now, the worst part of that situation, as if that wasn't bad enough, was the wife died 14 days later of something totally different. And it all went to her estranged daughter of 20 years. So this man's life's work and wealth, instead of going to his kids, went to this girl that nobody even hardly had a relationship with, just because he didn't understand how property passes. So it's important to know, because that's what the big picture of estate planning is looking at how all these things work together to accomplish your goals.
So key takeaway, we get this all the time, right? I know you do too. Having a will, say you think you've done what you need to do and you have a will, having that document doesn't mean that all your stuff is actually going to go through that will. It's all based on how you have your beneficiaries and the different titling of all these different accounts. So I meet with people as well, and they go, I've got a will and my assets are going to go through the will. We'll pull up their accounts and they have individuals named as a beneficiary, not the will, which means that that asset is never going to get to the will. And essentially you can have a will and it die void, or you can have a trust and it die void because there's nothing actually inside of it. So creating the plan, number one. Number two, making sure that the titling, right, is appropriate based on the type of plan that you have, whether that's a will, you want probate, you want to avoid probate, you want a trust, or just use beneficiary designations, right? You really have to understand how all of these things work together. So once you create an estate plan, you've got your will, you've got your trust, you've kind of got your end of life wishes as to who's going to get what. It's all set up properly. One more item that gets missed, because this isn't something that happens after we die. That's how most people plan, is what happens after I die. This third one is planning for incapacity. So how does this planning for incapacity really correlate to an estate plan, and what kind of documents are needed for individuals to make sure that they've planned appropriately?
Yeah, planning for incapacity, as Dan mentioned, often is put on the back burner, but it's really important, one, in who you name, because you're living but incapacitated. So this person is doing your day-to-day for you. You know, they have access to your finances, so you need to make sure you trust them, because you're not going to know if they're misappropriating or mismanaging your funds. And unfortunately, there's a lot of abuse in this area. They're going to make those end-of-life decisions for you regarding your health and things of that nature. Now, by not having planned for this, then a conservatorship is required in Tennessee, and that's essentially a process, that they have to go through that involves the courts, attorneys, doctors' testimony, just to get the authority to do what that power of attorney would have given them the ability to do. So to plan for incapacity, to have a well-rounded estate plan, as Dan mentioned, you need either a will or a trust for your end-of-life wishes, but you also need the power of attorney for finance, the power of attorney for healthcare. I always like to do HIPAAs for people, which is effective immediately, and it's just a list of people who can call and access information. And then the living will, which is your end-of-life wishes. If you have that, then you have a well-rounded estate plan, and you're protected on all fronts.
Yeah, I think having these pieces in place are incredibly important, and I've experienced this twice on my wife's side of the family. For one situation where they did have this kind of planning done, and I got to see how that really went through. Ultimately, that individual did end up passing. And then on another side as well, who had no planning, and kind of got to see what that experience was. And nobody wants to become incapacitated. Nobody wants to go to nursing homes or to, get dementia or Alzheimer's. Like, we don't plan to get those things. Everybody I talk to says that's never going to happen to me. And I'm, if that happens, then, I've got instructions to take care of it or whatever. Without these power of attorney documents, nothing is protected. And so you don't want to put your family through having to go through all these different processes. And really, again, you've worked hard for everything you have. Let's make sure that that stuff is protected while you're alive, but maybe not able to make those decisions or act on your own behalf of what's in your best interest for your goals. So if you have any questions about estate planning, wills, trust, beneficiary designations, probate, power of attorneys, all of these items in an estate plan, feel free to give our office a call. One of our advisors will talk to you. We'll get you hooked up with Ryan Knight to be able to answer some questions for you. You can reach us at 615-488-3039.